So he made it his main occupation to pass a law which would mandate that all Americans would have health care. Right? Now, what would have been the most effective way to do that? I mean, who would provide the health care most effectively and most efficiently?
One person, one entity.
Well, what would that
The
entity be?
government.
Yeah, federal government. Just like every developed nation in the world. Incidentally, since the end of the 19th century, Germany, under Bismarck, started the first state healthcare system. I'm saying that's 150 years ago. It's called a single payer system in the government. So what were the chances that was going to happen? I mean, that's, the government, it's like taking Medicare and blowing it up, right? What were the chances that was going to happen?
Very inevitable.
So you said it was a good chance.
Yes, definitely.
What do you say?
There's no chance.
There was no chance. That's why it didn't happen. Why was there no chance? Because the opponents would just use one word. It starts with an S.
Socialists.
Yeah. We're becoming like communist China. Right? So that meant that the single payer system was gone. So the next thing Obama said, well, I'm not, so I'll go to the next best thing. What was the next best thing? You have to force, you have to ensure that everyone has some form of health insurance. If the government wasn't going to do it, who was going to have to do it?
Private insurance companies.
You have private insurance companies. And you're going to have to force them to insure people. Even if they were already sick. Right? You know, that's one of the tricks that they use. You lose your job and you're sick and your health care from one job is now providing health care for you. Now you go to another job and they don't have to insure you. Right? Well, so Obama said, well, if that's the best we can do, then that's what we'll do. Well, how receptive, Dago, do you suppose the private insurance companies were to that? That they were going to have to insure sick people?
Not very happy about it.
So they lobbied their representatives and senators. And what was the final deal? Well, the final deal was doctors and hospitals and insurance companies could still charge whatever they wanted to charge. And so they wouldn't lose any money because now they would be insuring more people who would be paying more into them. So Obamacare is now still called socialism. It's not socialism at all. It's through private enterprise. So, and that was the downfall of it. So he had a noble goal, a really noble goal. Provide health care for everyone, right? Even the poorest among us, the unemployed among us. He identified the obstacles to the goal. But he couldn't come up with a method to overcome those obstacles that didn't compromise the nobility of the original plan. So now we have Obamacare, but he went past that heavily breathing rabbit. I couldn't make that up. And the back of my mind, I always thought that that's what it was. So, and it's now really a poor, average system. He couldn't get enough support. He wasn't crafty enough, like Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, to find a way to trick those senators and representatives to pass the original law. Do you understand what I'm saying? Obamacare now is just like a faint shadow of what it could have been. So that's the last and really the only before that, under Roosevelt and Truman, when there wasn't the volunteer army and Americans were drafted to fight World War II, we felt we had to repay all these people who risked their lives. Not only this country, but for free governments all around the world. So under Roosevelt and then finally Truman, what law did they push through? GI Bill. And what did that do for it? It really changed this country completely. Show you how. So that's the last noble thing that I think was done.
The Civil Rights Act.
The Civil Rights Act, yeah. After what event? What precipitated it? It was Selma. We also went to see, not only did we see the Lincoln, we saw Selma. Civil Rights Act. So what were some of the stipulations of the GI Bill?
Let's see, so you come back from the war, and
Yeah.
they pay
And the government would pay for what?
college, so you have jobs.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. That completely changed American higher education. Before then, when people went to college, they were sent there by their millionaire grandparents, who were ensuring that when they graduated, they would become like a CEO of their company. So therefore, what subjects could they study? These people who were assured of having a good paying job after they graduate, what are some of the subjects that they could study, that they could afford to study?
Economics,
Like French, 18th century French, why could they study subjects like that? Political philosophy, world literature, why could they afford to study liberal arts subjects like that?
Didn't matter.
Because they didn't need to take practical subjects, they were insured of a job. As soon as these millions and millions of men and women coming back from World War II, now their higher education was being paid by the federal government. They became the new consumers of colleges and universities all across the country. Understand? Who wanted the federal government's dollars paying the tuition for these people. These guys weren't insured of any job. They had to get a business degree, an engineering degree, every practical subject under the earth. Understand? And so the face of all college, virtually all colleges and universities around the country changed to all these practical subjects. What is your name?
Me?
Yeah.
Y'all.
Do you go to South?
I went there.
All right, so in all of the schools in the United States, what is the most popular major by far? And it all started after World War II. By far, it's not even close.
Engineering.
It's what?
Engineering?
At South and in every engineering school across the country, 99% of all the engineering students come from Ethiopia. I mean, it's true. What is the most popular major by far?
Business?
Without any question. See? People need jobs. People need jobs. So it changed the face. It also changed the face of the American environment. Before then, people either lived in the city and worked in factories in the city, in slums surrounding the factories, or they were farmers who lived out in the country, right? So another part of the GI Bill was that they would pay your mortgage. So where did they go? Where did all these GIs go to live?
In between the suburbs.
Yep, that's right. And because they're now living in the suburbs outside the cities, but they're still working in the cities, what had to come next?
Cars.
Interstate and cars and houses.
All these highways had to be built to bring these people, the millions of them on a daily basis, from their suburban homes into the city where they live. That's right. So that GI Bill really changed the face of America, economically, demographically, educationally. But it had to be done. We had to repay these guys. We didn't repay the Americans who fought in the American Revolution. You know that, don't you? Not at all. We didn't repay Americans who fought in the Civil War. We didn't repay people who fought in World War I. As a matter of fact, what precipitated the New Deal and the failure of Herbert Hoover in the election of Franklin Roosevelt was when the World War I soldiers who were never paid all came to Washington, D.C. and set up these little camps, tents and wood. And they called the area around Congress, they called it Hooverville. And Hoover gave the order to Douglas MacArthur and his aide, Dwight Eisenhower, to take tanks and just destroy them all. The papers covered it, and there was no chance that Hoover was going to be reelected. So in World War II, we said we weren't going to ever do that again. Well, there you are. Civil Rights Act, of course, as you correctly point out. But it's mainly because we just mock ideals. If you can't get past step one, how do you get past 2, 3, 4, or even hope for, depending on luck? We make a mockery of it. We're just so cynical. We really are. Americans tend to be so cynical. One time we claimed to be idealistic was when George W. Bush decided to send, let's start it off. As we look back, we're smarter than Jeb Bush. So as we look back to the turn of the 21st century, who turned out to be the linchpin of the Middle East? What nation and what ruler in particular? Osborne. It turns out from hindsight, it was hard to know it then, but that's what makes a superior leader superior to an average leader. Ironically, who turned out to be the linchpin, what country and what leader of a stable Middle East? Osborne. It was Saddam Hussein, and it was Iraq. What's the most powerful nation in the Middle East now? By far. The irony is that the United States is counting on them to defeat ISIS.
Iran.
It's Iran.
Iran?
It's Iran. And what country was the only country to hold off Iran?
Iran.
So here you had this brutal dictator. It would be hard to find a more brutal dictator in world history than Saddam Hussein. Ruling over this country, kind of like a medieval country. It only was a country because the people were brutalized by this dictator. It wasn't a country because it was all these isolated clans and tribes. If you said one word against him, he murdered you, your mother, your sister, and had his sons rape your granddaughters. And these are not exaggerations, this is exactly what happened. So in a fit of idealism, George W. Bush said we're going to send, and still his father, who could see the handwriting on the wall, resisted invading Iraq and remember? Remember what he said? He said, if you break it, you own it. Do you remember that? So George W. Bush says we'll send 100,000 American troops into Iraq. And within a few months, all the Iraqis will be enjoying democratic government. They'll be playing baseball, eating apple pie, and singing God Bless America. Now, you can't be more idealistic than that. But he didn't recognize step 2, which is
Obstacles.
and the obstacles were the only thing holding that tinderbox together. You understand? From Syria all the way to Iran was this brutal scumbag. Now, how could he have known that he was undertaking a very perilous attempt to ignore the history of the Middle East and ignore the history of Iraq and attempt to defeat it in a month and a half, make Baghdad be like Iowa? How could he have known if he was intelligent, if he could see forever, or at least he had advisors who could see forever?
He could have looked at history.
Yeah.
What has happened in history? And Iraq became a country only after World War I. Woodrow Wilson looked at the map and said, this will be called Iraq. And made the mistake of bringing all these tribes and clans together who had hated each other, Sunni and Shia. I mean, my head just, I just get a headache at me. They talk about, well, I mean, let's start with Alexander the Great. He's called Alexander the Great because he's one of the greatest generals of all time. He also was a megalomaniac. He really wanted to defeat the world. He's defeating people left and right. He gets to the area of what is now called Iraq and is dead within a week. I mean, see, there's no one to defeat. Do you understand? There's no government to defeat. It's like thousands of clans and tribes. After Alexander the Great, who also tried to defeat that area?
Napoleon.
And the British Empire. No country in all of world history has defeated more of the world and held more of the world under its colonial thumb than England. They had no success in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Because there was no one to defeat.
And the Russians had tried 20 years
And
before.
then the Russians went into Afghanistan and Iraq.